Good afternoon, students. So today's video, we're going to go over sentence fragments and how to avoid sentence fragments. And sentence fragments means that you don't have a complete sentence, or that you have an incomplete thought. And so you want to avoid sentence fragments in your essay. So here is my lesson today, is to learn enough sentence structure so that you can avoid sentence fragments in your essay. So I will share my screen, and I am going over my lesson. Hold on, before I share my screen, I'm going over the sentence fragment lesson from the Rules for Writers, Diana Hacker, Nancy Summers book, 8th edition. So if you want to get that book, I believe it's now in its 10th edition, you can for your English 101 class. It's an excellent book for teaching you writing and APA. So for today's lesson, we're going to go over sentence fragments. What is a sentence fragment? A sentence fragment is a word group that pretends to be a sentence. Sentence fragments are easy to recognize when they appear out of context, like these. When the cat leaped onto the table, running for the bus. When fragments appear next to related sentences, however, they are harder to spot. We had just sat down to dinner. When the cat leaped onto the table, I tripped and twisted my ankle, running for the bus. And so in all of this, when you have a sentence fragment, it means that you don't have a complete thought. So if I say when the cat leaped onto the table, is that a complete thought? No. And so that's a sentence fragment. Running for the bus, is that a complete thought? No. So that's a sentence fragment. We had just come down to dinner. Okay, that's a complete thought. When the cat leaped onto the table, that is not a complete thought. I tripped and twisted my ankle, that's a complete thought. Running for the bus is not a complete thought. Many times a sentence fragment occurs when you're missing parts of the sentence, like if you're missing the subject or the verb. In order to have a complete thought in English, you have to have a sentence, verb, and object. For that is how you have a complete sentence, simple sentence. Recognizing sentence fragments. To be a sentence, a word group must consist of at least one independent clause, that is subject, verb, and object. An independent clause includes a subject, verb, and if either stands alone or could stand alone. To test whether a word group is a complete sentence or a fragment, you can use the chart on page 189. That's page 180. By using the flow chart, you can see exactly why when the cat leaped onto a table is a fragment. It has a subject and a verb, cat and leaped, but it begins with a subordinating conjunction when, which makes the word group a dependent clause. So whenever you start an independent clause with a subordinate conjunction, you end up with a dependent clause, which is not a complete thought. Running for the bus is a fragment because it lacks a subject and a verb. And running is a verbal, not a verb. So repairing sentence fragments. You can repair most fragments in one of two ways. Pull the fragment into a nearby sentence. Rewrite the fragment as a complete sentence. So here you could say, we had just sat down to dinner when the cat leaped onto the table. And so here you would attach the fragment onto another sentence. Running for the bus. I tripped and twisted my ankle. So here you would attach this running for the bus with another sentence. So here is a test for fragments. Is there a verb? Is there a subject? If it's missing a verb or missing a subject, then it becomes a fragment. Is the word group merely a subordinate conjunction, a subordinate clause, because it begins with a word such as because or when? So if the dependent clause starts with a subordinating conjunction, it is a fragment. Is there a verb? If you say yes. Is there a subject? Yes. Is there a subordinating conjunction? No. Then it is a sentence. So you can use this flow chart in order to help you determine if a sentence is a fragment or not. Do not mistake verbals for verbs. A verbal is a verb form, such as walking, that does not function as a verb or a clause. The subject of a verb may be you, understood but not present in the sentence. A sentence may open with a subordinate clause, but the sentence must also include an independent clause. Unlike some other languages, English requires a subject and a verb in every sentence except in command, where the you is understood. So it is often hot and humid during the summer. And so here you need to have a subject and a verb. You can't just say is hot and humid during the summer like you can do in Spanish. Students are usually very busy at the end of the semester writing papers and taking exams. So here you have to have a subject, verb, and then the rest of it is an object. And so here, a subordinate, whenever you have any of these words, okay, these are all subordinating conjunctions. And if you have any of those words that start a sentence, then automatically that sentence becomes a dependent clause, and it becomes a sentence fragment, and it cannot stand alone. And therefore it needs another independent clause in order to complete the sentence. So a subordinate clause is patterned like a sentence with both a subject and a verb, but it begins with a word that marks it as subordinate. So the following words commonly introduce subordinate clauses: after, although, as if, because, before, even though, how, if, since, so that, then, that, though, unless, until, when, where, whether, which, while, who, whom, whose, why. Subordinate clauses function within sentences as adjectives, as adverbs, or as nouns. They cannot stand alone. Most fragmented clauses beg to be pulled into a sentence nearby. Americans have come to fear the West Nile virus because it is transmitted by the common mosquito. Because introduces a subordinate clause, so it cannot stand alone. For punctuation of subordinate clauses appearing at the end of a sentence, see 33F. Although psychiatrist Peter Kramer expresses concerns about Prozac, many other doctors believe that the benefits of antidepressants outweigh the risks. So although introduces a subordinate clause which cannot stand alone. If a fragmented clause cannot be attached to a nearby sentence, or you feel that attaching it would be awkward, try turning the clause into a sentence. The simplest way to do this is delete the opening word or words that mark the clause as subordinate. Population increases and uncontrolled development are taking a deadly toll on the environment. Across the globe, fragile ecosystems are collapsing. Attach fragmented phrases or turn them into sentences. Like subordinate clauses, phrases function within sentences as adjectives, as adverbs, or as nouns. They cannot stand alone. Fragmented phrases are often prepositional or verbal phrases. Sometimes they are appositives, words, or word groups that rename nouns or pronouns. Often, a fragmented phrase may simply be pulled into a nearby sentence. The archaeologists worked slowly, examining and labeling every pottery they uncovered. And so here, the word group examining is a verbal phrase, so it cannot stand alone. The patient displayed symptoms of ALS, a neurodegenerative disease. So a neurodegenerative disease is an appositive, renaming the noun. And so if a fragmented phrase cannot be pulled into a sentence, into a nearby sentence effectively, turn the phrase into a sentence. You may need to add a subject or a verb. In the training session, Jamie explained how to access our new database. She also taught us how to submit expense reports and request vendor payments. The revision turns the fragmented phrase into a sentence by adding a subject and a verb. Attach other fragmented word groups or turn them into sentences. Other word groups that are commonly fragmented include parts of common predicates, lists, and examples introduced by for example, in addition, or similar expressions. Parts of compound predicates. A predicate consists of a verb and its objects, complements, and modifiers. Usually a predicate comes right after the subject. A compound predicate includes two or more predicates joined with a coordinating conjunction such as and, but, or. Because the parts of a compound predicate have the same subject, they should appear in the same sentence. The woodpecker finch of the Galapagos Islands carefully selects a twig of a certain size and shape, and then uses this tool to pry out grubs from trees. And so here you connect the incomplete sentence into a nearby sentence. Lists. To correct a fragmented list, often you can attach it to a sentence with a colon or a dash. Yeah, I do that all the time. It has been said that there are only 3 indigenous American art forms: musical, comedy, jazz, and soap opera. Sometimes terms like especially, namely, like, such as, introduce fragmented lists. Such fragments can usually be attached to the preceding sentence. In the 20th century, the South produced some great American writers, such as Flannery O'Connor, William Faulkner, Alice Walker, and Tennessee Williams. Examples introduced by for example, in addition, or similar expressions. Other expressions that introduce examples or explanations can lead to unintentional fragments. Although you may begin a sentence with some of the following words or phrases, make sure that what follows has a subject and a verb. So also, and, but, for example, for instance, in addition. Often the easiest solution is to turn the fragment into a sentence. In his memoir, Primo Levi describes the horrors of living in a concentration camp. For example, he worked without food and suffered emotional abuse. Deborah Tannen's research reveals that men and women have different ideas about communication. For example, Tannen explains that a woman expects her husband to be a new and improved version of her best friend. Exception. A fragment may be used for effect. Usually you would use a hyphen or a colon for that. Writers occasionally use sentence fragments for special purposes. Following the dramatic Americanization of their children, even my parents grew more publicly confident, especially my mother. In my opinion, if you're going to emphasize using especially, if you're going to emphasize a fragment, you should put a dash over here so that your English teacher understands that you know the difference between a fragment, sentence fragment, a complete sentence, and a dash. Are their new drug tests 100% reliable? Not in the opinion of most experts. And now the opposing arguments. Not again. Fewer carbs, improved taste. Commercials use a lot of fragments. Although fragments are sometimes appropriate, writers and readers do not always agree on when they are appropriate. So for your beginning English 101 class, stay away from these kinds of fragments. Even if fancy writers sometimes put in fragments for effect, but for your beginning English class, you just need to stay away from fragments completely so that your English teacher knows that you know the difference between a complete sentence and an incomplete sentence. And a fragment is an incomplete sentence. So that's my spiel on sentence fragments. You can avoid sentence fragments by using verbals as sentence fragments and avoid having subordinate conjunctions in your sentences. If you're going to use a subordinate conjunction, you turn that sentence into a dependent clause, and then you need another independent clause to complete the sentence. When you have a dependent clause and an independent clause together as one sentence, that's known as a complex sentence. And so in my next video, I'm going to go over run-on sentences and how to avoid run-on sentences. So if you have any questions, feel free. If you have any questions about sentence fragments and how to avoid sentence fragments, feel free to email me anytime.